Well, hello, good afternoon to everybody. Well, perhaps for somebody, good morning or even good evening, since there are people from more than 15 countries attending this international conference. Thank you very much to everybody for attending this conference. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much to the universities participating in this seminar. Of course, thank you to Google. And now we are going to start this international conference, the first conference of the new South European Union Google Data Governance Chair. Most of you know that for more than 10 years, the Google Chair on Privacy, Society and Innovation is working, and now we are launching a new international chair supported by Google, with the participation of four very relevant universities. University Roma III, University of Athens, and Nova Universidade de Lisbon. And of course, CEU San Paulo University of Madrid. Well, this international conference must be online.
Ahora tampoco.
Unfortunately, we hope that next one will be in presence, but since the circumstances that everybody knows are, for us it's impossible to organize in other way the conference. We have, I think, an amazing conference with two roundtables, two panels. The first one on data governance, the second one on international data flows. And we have also of reflection about the most important problems regarding data protection, the fundamental rights of privacy and data governance, and the future of all these very important topics. The first to speak when Giorgia Aveltino. Giorgia Aveltino is Senior Director of Government Relations and Public Policy for South Europe Google. Thank you very much, Georgia, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Piñar, and thank you to everyone who is connected here. I would like to start with a thank you note, but this is not a formal act. I really would like to thank you, the European Data Protection Supervisor, and I really would like to thank you, the four universities here represented by the rectors who are part of this chair. Because this is really, as you, José Luis, underlined, an important project that started in Madrid, that started with the University San Pablo CEU of Madrid, but has now become a South European project. So thank you very much to the Universidad Nova de Lisboa, Università di Roma III, and the National Capodistran University of Athens for being part of such an important initiative. And thank you very much, of course, to the rectors and to the professors that animate and are at the heart of this, as you underlined, Professor Piñar, an independent group, a group of independent and an independent group of universities that want to do, I think, what? Well, they want to go further than just analyzing privacy and the impact of privacy on society in the digital age, and to enlarge and broaden the scope to data governance. And why is this important? Well, we are seeing that data governance and all the different aspects of data governance are now more than ever, and perhaps in the future more than ever, entrenched with our life, with life of each and every citizen around the world. So having a group of academics that can really analyze, make an analysis, and understand what is the rationale and what are the dynamics behind this relation is particularly important. Not just, of course, to understand, but first to understand, and I hope then to also shape the scenario and shape, the future regulation that will shape the future digital ecosystem. You know perhaps that Google is particularly committed to the work of the academics and the research community. So this is one of the most important commitment and one of the most important projects, if not, I would say, the most important that we have in Europe, and we strongly believe that can contribute substantially to the shaping of the debate. Again, going back to the point of data governance, that is, of course, a very relevant area for technology and digital transformation. One thing I strongly believe is the possibility is that it is possible to have an impactful data-driven innovation coupled, so at the same time, with a strong guarantee of fundamental rights like the right to privacy. And the GDPR, of course, has been one key moment, I would say a point of inflection in this scenario. But we know there are in the pipeline many other regulations and many other pieces of legislation that are going to have a strong impact on citizens. E-privacy regulation, Data Governance Act, DMA or Digital Market Act, the AI regulation, etc., etc. So having this group also discussing this, I think it would be important. And let me close with one final remark that I think is center of attention definitely for the business, but I think it's center of attention also for the academic environment, that is about the international data flow, is of course a topic of huge, enormous importance. And unfortunately, we have seen that the summit between the European Union and the US last week didn't really bring a lot of changes into this debate. And we know at the same time that the business community, and of course Google is included, is particularly worried that this can have a negative impact, a negative effect on well, in Europe on the digital single market, but I would say on trade more broadly. So maintaining cooperation and free legally secure data transfer between the two sides of the Atlantic is definitely a priority, and that's why I'm very happy, and I will follow with great attention the panel that will discuss this topic. So without any further ado, because people after me are much more relevant and are going to say very important things, I would like to leave the floor to you, Professor Pignard, and again, thank you very much to everyone involved in this project and to the people that are, of course, following this conference for being here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Georgia. And now, Professor Vincenzo Senosenkovic, full professor of comparative law at the Università Roma Tre, have the floor on behalf of the university.
Thank you, Professor Pignard. I'm very grateful for, in behalf of my university, that the Roma Tre University has been involved in this project. And Roma Tre is relatively recent as compared to other universities. Universities have 25 years, but this has enabled it to work a lot on new topics and new technology topics and digital technology topics. Over the last years, we have done numerous numbers of initiatives in this field. Over the last years, we have been organizing a data-driven innovation open summit, and we have coordinated an Italian research project on governance of data, governance through data, and therefore we feel very glad and grateful to be involved in this initiative, and we do hope that in the near future we will be able to host one of on the conferences of the South European Chair in Rome, which I know is greatly appreciated by everybody, and also to have the pleasure to meet you and colleagues, distinguished colleagues, also to meet you in presence.
Thank you very much, Professor Zenkovic. And now is Professor Francisco Pereira Coutinho, della Universidad de Nova de Lisboa, Vice Dean of the Nova School of Law, and you have the floor on behalf of the university, your university.
Thank you so much, Professor José Luis Piñar. Nova School of Law is absolutely delighted to integrate the Southern European Google Data Governance Chair alongside universities with whom we have been through the years having a fruitful cooperation through Erasmus Agreement and multiple EU-funded research projects. I would like then first to salute our partner universities of São Paulo, Roma III, and Athens University. Moreover, I would like to stress that data governance is one of the research priorities of Nova School of Law, which is channeled mainly through our Master in Law and Technology, where we discuss thoroughly topics such as big data, artificial intelligence, or international data transfers, and particularly always with the support of Grasek and Muniz, which is channeled through the Observatory of Data Protection, which is a research group whose development was crucially impacted by the granting of a Google Policy Fellowship 3 years ago. I am sure that the share will have an even greater impact in data research in our school. Thank you so much, Google, for partnering again with us in these innovative and crucial fields of research, which are crucial for the development of our countries. Thank you so much and have a good conference.
Thank you very much, Professor Francisco Coutinho. And now is Professor Meletios Athanasios Dimopoulos, Rector of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, that you have the floor. Thank you very much, Rector.
Esteemed colleagues from universities of San Pablo, Madrid, Roma III, and Nova University of Lisbon, welcome on behalf of the rectoral authorities of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to Google Chair Conference on Privacy, Society, and Innovation. Our university is an active part of this initiative via the Laboratory of Law and Informatics of our School of Law, represented today by Professor Yiannopoulos. I would like to thank Google for their significant support, having put together in this engaging program. Data governance has gained an importance in recent years, while a holistic view will guide both practitioners and researchers. The interesting thing about this conference is the international perspective our members bring to these discussions because of its academic and political impact. Our university is largely executing the activities necessary for managing data and shaping the data policies and data sharing agreements. The National Kapodistrian University of Athens is a top research intensive university where faculty, PhD candidates, and researchers continuously challenge the boundaries of knowledge and publish their work in high-caliber research journals. Universities were and still remain a crucial part in every society. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has proved that it is high time we enhance our efforts for more internationalized university widely open to cooperation with other universities and abroad. Our university participates in the CBIS complex with other 7 universities according to the decision made in 2018 by the European Commission. We strongly believe that universities are about knowledge, innovation, as well as the pursuit of excellence. We are committed to work towards the advancement of critical human capacities, contribute to sustainable development and social cohesion, promotes Europe's cultural heritage with respect to the principles of democracy, ethics, and cultural diversity. The internationalization of the University of Athens is a priority of our rectal authorities and members of our academic community. Decades of cooperation with partner institutions from many European countries, as well as the participation of our university in international organizations, associations, and networks, have led to a consistent development of our university's international profile and its fundamental role in student and staff mobility. I sincerely hope that we will enjoy today's conference, and once again I would like to thank Google. Thank you all for your participation, and also particularly thank my colleague Professor Yiannopoulos for representing our institution in this important symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Rector. And now we have the floor, the Rector of CEU San Pablo University, Professor Rosa Visiedo, but unfortunately for her it was impossible to attend in person the conference, but we can hear a video from her. Perhaps we can wait just a few seconds before seeing the video.
Rectors, European Data Protection Supervisor, representative of Google and of the universities participating in the conference, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the CEU San Pablo University. It is my pleasure to open the annual International Conference of the Google Chair on Privacy, Society and Innovation of our university. It has been 10 years since the collaboration between Google and CEU San Pablo University began, through the creation of the Google Chair, a chair in which the beloved Francisco Ruiz Antón put so much effort and to whom we are still grateful. The relationship between one of the most important companies in the world and our university has been very fruitful in the form of seminars, conferences, publications, and the master's degree in data protection, transparency and access to information. Moreover, this international conference will mark the launch and the beginning of the activities of the South European Union Google Data Governance Chair, headed by our CEU professor, José Luis Piñar. This chair integrates three other prestigious universities: the Nova University in Lisbon, the University of Athens, and the University of Roma III. It has, thus, become an international chair with a global vocation. It is an example of internationalization and technological innovation, which I both fully support. I am convinced that a modern university must promote research and collaboration with other universities and with civil society and business. The chair will focus on scientific data governance research in Europe. In addition, it will serve as a framework to analyze the European challenges in areas such as big data, data-driven innovation, artificial intelligence, or international personal data flows. It is a great opportunity for experts from different countries to meet and share their knowledge, their concerns, and their best practices. The use of technology is so sophisticated and complex that we need to address it not only from a technological perspective, but also from a legal and moral one. We must all put technology at the service of the individual. I therefore reiterate my personal and institutional support for the South European Union Google Data Governance Chair. Hence, I would like to thank Google once again for its support. I would like to thank the work of the Georgia Aveltino, Maria Alvarez Caro, and our professor José Luis Piñar. I would also like to thank the three universities, Roma Tre, Nova de Lisboa, and Athens, for their collaboration. And my thanks to the speakers at this seminar, whose presence demonstrates the seriousness and commitment of the initiative. Finally, let me wish you a successful and productive conference. I hope that you enjoy this annual meeting organized by CEU San Pablo University and its Google Chair. Thank you very much.
The intervention of Georgia Aveltino and representatives of the four universities. Now we have the honor and the pleasure to have the intervention of the EDPS, Mr. Wojciech Wieborowski. Thank you very much, Wojciech, for attending this international conference. Everybody knows the EDPS, everybody knows Wojciech Wieborowski. He was first deputy supervisor and we've been talking together. He was the Polish Data Protection Authority. You are one of the most well-known experts on privacy. Thank you very much for your very well work as EDPS, and thank you very much for attending this conference, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Pina. That's actually honor, especially for me, to be among the professors, to be among those who are looking from with the scientific eye on what's going on in the real world, what is going on in the technologies, and what is going on in the political approach to that and legal approach to that. That's also interesting for me because I still keep the role of the academic as well, being the professor in the Department of Legal Informatics in the University of Gdansk, my alma mater in northern Poland. But of course, that's not why I'm here. I'm here rather as the European Data Protection Supervisor, the representative of the institution, which is the supervisory institution of the European Union, bodies, agencies, institutions, which means that the European Data Protection Supervisor is not over all the data protection authorities in Europe. There are 27 jurisdictions in this field in the European Union, and the 28th is the one for the institutions, bodies, and agencies of the EU. But what is probably more important and what I would try to concentrate on during this short introduction is the fact that we are the main advisors in the legislative process in the European Union. And also we are providing the Secretariat for the European Data Protection Board, which is consisting of all the data protection authorities from the European Union countries and also the countries of the European Economic Area. So we have the active participation of Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein in the activities of this board. And this is the angle from which I will look at the moment to the environment that we are all dealing with. So I would like for a moment emphasize the importance of the legal research in the context of the work of the European Data Protection Supervisor. This is reflected in our published opinions, in the guidances, in the tech dispatches, in the monthly meetings that we have with the representatives of the research community, because we are of the opinion that we cannot stay only in the bubble of the politicians and in the bubble of the people who are representing the industry, or even the civic society representatives. We have to look at the scientific approach to the problems that we have. The European Union has done much and definitely will continue to do so in the context of establishing the clear framework for the data flows, for the data governance. But I will be also a little bit provocative in this short presentation, because I will say which are the parts of the activities of the European Union institutions in the legal field which we don't like too much as the European Data Protection Supervisor, not because of the typical privacy issues or the data protection issues, but also because of blurring these frameworks that are already existing. So these initiatives undoubtedly result in increasing complexity of the digital of the law on the digital governance and on the market governance in this field. And let me give some examples of the situation that we have at the moment. As you know, more than a year ago, or a year and a half ago, the European Commission has presented the strategy for data and wanted to create the single European data space and thus make it easier for the businesses and for the public authorities to get an access to high quality data. EDPS strongly believes that one of the most important objectives of the strategy should be to prove the viability of and sustainability of an alternative data economy models, the open, fair, and democratic one. The EDPS has published the opinion on the strategy, and while we appreciated the Commission's commitment to ensure that the European fundamental rights and values, including the right to the protection of the personal data, are kept, we had some criticism towards the specific points, and it also then went to the legal acts that were proposed in the result of that. While the Digital Services Act that has been proposed and Digital Markets Act, in our opinion, generally value a lot for this clear framework to be established. We have a lot of doubts about Data Governance Act. So at the point when we are starting to talk about the idea of governance presented at the moment by the European Commission, we think that there is a lot to clarify. There is a lot to simplify in this point. In our opinion, the subject matter and the scope of the proposal is quite strange, especially if we know that still there is a Data Act which is coming. We already saw the proposal, we already saw the draft, and we don't see the clear distinction between the scope of these two proposals. The definitions and the terminology of the proposal of the Governance Act is also something to talk about. And the nice words, nice notions like data altruism, for example, don't work that well when you try to consider them being the definitions in the legal act. and there is a unclarity if the new solutions are different than the ones that we had, for example, in the General Data Protection Regulation, or these are the things which are extending or probably the exceptions from the constructions which are there. So there is also this blurring distinction between the personal data and non-personal data, which of course is contextual anyway. And also the governance model and the supervision model, which is proposed in this act, is something to think about. So while the strategy gives the very interesting horizon to be achieved, especially as far as the data pools are concerned, the practice is to be worked on. That also applies to the discussion about the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is probably the other one to deal with. We had some doubts. We had some doubts about the necessity of this solution, necessity of this proposal, but we have to say that the biggest part of the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is proposed by the European Commission, is of use, and it supplements the missing parts of the European legislation. But at the same time, the subject is extremely complex, and the opinion that was taken by the European Data Protection Supervisor and the European Data Protection Board just at the end of last week and published this Monday shows some concerns that the data protection authorities may have. But of course, we are right now open for the discussion about the final outcome to be achieved by the European Union law in order to facilitate the development of the market, in order to remove the unclear situations, but not to create the new unclear fields. So I would like to thank for the idea of making this conference and for the presence of the speakers that you invited. But first of all, I would like to really thank for the idea of the cooperation of the universities that building on the strong ground they have in their institutions can build a network that we can use the fruits of. So Professor Piñar, congratulations for the conference. I hope that I will hear here the solutions or proposed solutions to be used by the legislators and maybe even more practical for me by the regulators existing on this complicated one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting speech. In fact, we are in front of a subject extremely complex, and we are at your disposal and at the disposal of the institution, European institution, for clarifying the legal scenario and the very topics concerned data protection and data governance. There is a lot to simplify, perhaps, and we here at the chair, with the cooperation of these four universities, we are at your disposal. Thank you very much for attending this meeting, and thank you very much indeed for your speech, dear Wojciech, dear European Data Protection Supervisor. Thank you very much. And now, after this keynote speech, after the opening remarks, we can start with the first panel on the data governance, concept of data governance, the future of data governance. Then
after this first panel, we'll have the second one on international data flows. For this panel, we have the presence of the members of the board of the chair, Professor Georgios Giannopoulos, Professor Maria de Gracia Canto-Moniz, and Professor Vincenzo Senosenkovic. Professor Georgios Giannopoulos is Associate Professor of IT Law and Legal Informatics at the School of Law at the University of Athens. Since 2015, he directs the Laboratory of Law and Informatics, has studied at the University of Athens, and has a PhD from the University of London. He has professional qualifications in computer programming and system analysis, and he's admitted to the Athens Bar Associations, and I think it's the DPO of the university. Maria de Gracia Canto-Moniz holds a PhD in data protection law from Nova School of Law, la Nova de Direito. During her research, she was a visiting researcher at Georgetown University and at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Since 2019, she teaches data protection and management law at the Nova School of Law. And since 2020, she teaches public law, constitutional and administrative law. And Professor Vincenzo Senosenkovic is full professor of comparative law at the University of Roma III, where he teaches comparative legal system and EU transport law. He is also the director of the studying law at Roma III program. He has received degrees in political science and in law from the University of Roma, La Sapienza, and has studied in Harvard School and in Cambridge University. He's been visiting professor in numerous European and North American universities. From 2012 and to 2015, he has been rector of the Rome University for International Studies. He is since 2013 chairman of the Italian Association of Comparative Law. And from 2018, he's member of the Independent ICT Authority of the Republic of San Marino. Thank you very much to everybody. Now we are discuss about data governance, and it's me to speak first. Well, just because of systematic reasons, not because other kind of reasons. I'm going to talk in just a few minutes about the concept of governance. Since the chair is a data governance chair, perhaps the first thing that we have clear is what governance is. First of all, I would like to express again my satisfaction and gratitude for being able to present today the New South European Google Data Governance Chairs. Satisfaction because, as the rector, Professor Visiedo of San Pablo University has pointed out, this chair recognizes the work that the Google EU Chair on Privacy, Security and Innovation has been carrying out for almost 10 years. And because a qualitative leap has been made by now, integrating from 4 prestigious universities that will undoubtedly promote a forum for serious and objective debate on the main issues facing the governance of personal data, a subject that is one of the most relevant for society and for its development. I would like to thank again the universities for the participation, and to Google, of course, for its support, sponsorship, and for the impetus it gives to research on the subject that is, as I say, of great importance for all of us. My thanks also as coordinator of the chair to the speakers, and in particular to my good friend, the European Data Protection Supervisor.
Just a few words about Teusapan University. Is the first private university approved by law in Spain, ranked as the sixth best university in Spain. It's part of the CEU educational group, the most important educational group in Spain, with 3 universities: Abat Oliva in Barcelona, Cardenal Herrera in Valencia, and San Pablo CEU in Madrid, and numerous non-university schools, as well as Universitas Senioribus, where it provides formal education to almost 2,000 students. San Pablo University has 2 campuses in Madrid, one in Moncloa, another in the Principe, with more than 10,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students. Likewise, the International Doctoral School, the so-called INDO, which integrates the 3 universities, has more than 200 students from more than 10 countries in Europe, Africa, and America. Well, having said that, I would now like to share with you some thoughts on the concept and scope of governance, which will be one of the central points of the new chair. To do so, I will start from the definition of governance in the dictionary of the Royal Spanish Academy, which seems to me to be very correct, even from a legal point of view. Note that the proposal for a Data Governance Act does not include a definition of governance. The definition of governance from the dictionary is as follows: art of way of governing that aims to achieve lasting economic, social, and institutional development, promoting a healthy balance between the state, civil society, and the market economy. So governance is a broader notion than government, and for that matter also related concepts like the state, good governance, and regime, and goes on to state. Good government also implies accountability, transparency, participation, openness, and the rule of law. One of the foremost experts in governance theory, Professor Goran Haydn, has pointed out that governance involves interaction between the formal institutions and those in civil society. Governance refers to a process whereby elements in society wield power, authority, and influence, and enact policies and decisions concerning public life and social upliftment. The contribution of Goran Haydn to bring greater clarity to the concept of governance needs, in my opinion, special attention. He elevates governance to an umbrella concept to define an approach to comparative politics, an approach that fills analytical gaps left by others. Using a governance approach, he emphasized the creative potential of politics, especially with the ability of leaders to rise above the existing structure of the ordinary, to change the rules of the game, and to inspire others to partake in efforts to move society forward in new unpredictable directions. As we boil down to topics like governance is a conceptual approach, governance concerns big questions of a constitutional nature that establish the rules of political conduct. Governance involves creative intervention by political actors to change a structure that inhibits the expression of human potential. Governance is a rational concept, emphasizing the nature of interactions between state and social actors and among social actors themselves. Governance refers to particular types of relationships among political actors, that is, those which are socially sanctioned rather than arbitrary. This is what we must bear in mind when considering the idea of data governance, which has deserved the attention of the European Union in the proposal for a Data Governance Act, which will be analyzed by Professor
Maria Grasa Canto-Moniz. The ideal governance calls for a broad perspective on the regulation that has to do with the use of data. These are referred to in the proposal of Data Governance Act, GDPR, e-Privacy, Digital Market Act, Digital Services Act, and keep at least two issues in mind. First, the importance of the principle of accountability, as is mentioned in Article 34 of the GDPR. I'm sorry for always quoting this article, but in my opinion, it is essential. Taking the Article 24 GDPR states as follows: taking into account the nature, scope, context, and purposes of possession, as well as the risk of varying likelihood and severity for the rights and freedoms of natural persons, the controller shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure and to be able to demonstrate that processing is performed in accordance with this regulation. So, it's the same to say that processor is performed in accordance with the fundamental right to data protection. This is the issue to have in mind, the first one. And the secondly, the importance of ethics. It's important to keep in mind the relationship between ethics and law. But, in my opinion, without forgetting that law, the ethical point of view is very important, is a key point in the development of data governance. It's necessary to underline and to really describe what we can consider as ethics. To summarize, therefore, it's necessary to bear in mind that when we talk about governance, we are talking about a broad concept that includes numerous responsibilities for numerous actors. All this from the perspective of the fundamental right to data protection. Also far my thoughts, and now Professor Maria de Grasa Canto-Moniz. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Piñar. Good afternoon, everyone. And before exploring the topic that we are discussing today, which is data governance, let me start by saying that it is a pleasure to be part of this panel today, and it is also a pleasure to be part of this project. I hope that I can help to contribute to the goals that were already stated, and I would also like to stress what my colleague and friend Francisco Pereira Coutinho already mentioned, which is my belief that Nova School of Law is very well placed to be successful in this partnership because, as my colleague mentioned, we have built a lot in the field of data protection. We have organized several courses, online courses, even before the pandemic. We have an online open source journal, which is called Anuário da Proteção de Dados. We have a lot of master's students researching data governance related subjects, also PhD students. And so now is the time to start sharing this knowledge in other ways and to deepen some of our lines of research, because this project is about data governance, and data protection is at the core of this concept, but the EU is energetically regulating the digital realm, so other initiatives are also relevant. And today I would like to share with you some thoughts about one of those initiatives, and especially its connection with the GDPR. I have prepared a very short presentation that I will now share with you in a moment. I hope that everyone can see the presentation. I can see it myself, so I'm assuming that everyone else is also seeing the presentation. So, starting with a very short explanation on what is the Data Governance Act. This was already mentioned by the European Data Protection Supervisor, and Professor Pinar also stressed some of its components. So the DGA, the Data Governance Act, is still a draft proposal, and it is one of the first set of measures that were announced in the 2020 European Strategy for Data. It is a cornerstone piece of legislation on sharing and reusing data available in the public sector. The main goals of the Data Governance Act are two. It aims to foster the availability of data for use by increasing trust in data intermediaries. The word trust, I think it's in all the recent initiatives of the EU, also in the GDPR. One of the objectives of protecting personal data is to ensure that data subjects trust in organizations when they process their data. But this DGA also aims to strengthening data sharing mechanism across the EU, the so-called European data spaces, including in the area of health. This second goal is also related with another objective of the GDPR, which is ensuring the free flow of data in the European internal market. And this idea of European data spaces is also very much connected with the free flow of data. However, despite these objectives, there are some consistency problems, not only with the GDPR, but also with other initiatives. For example, since 2018, there is also a regulation on the free flow of non-personal data, and there is also a directive from 2019 which regulates open data and reuse of public sector information, called the so-called Open Data Directive. However, I will focus on the next minutes only on the GDPR, and I will start by saying that, of course, this Data Governance Act is not meant to operate in a vacuum. So the main point of this presentation is that the interplay between this act and the GDPR needs to be clarified. And it needs to be clarified in a couple of topics. Some were already stressed by the European Data Protection Supervisor, and the others I would also like to dwell on them. So the DGA introduces a couple of new definitions. For example, the concept of data holder, the concept of data sharing service provider, the concept of user. But it is quite unclear not only the scope of these definitions, but also how they are applied in the data protection world. For example, will a data user be considered a data subject, or can it also be considered a data controller or even a data processor? Secondly, the DGA also regulates the reuse of personal data, but it also applies to non-personal data of the public sector. And this might blur the distinction between these two types of data. In fact, the DGA introduces a new method to obtain data, which is called permission, but it does not clarify if this refers only to non-personal data. And if it is also applicable to personal data, it is quite unclear how it will relate to the legal basis for the processing of personal data that we know and are stated in Article 6 and Article 9 of the GDPR. Additionally, there is another problem, which is that the DGA does not address clearly the issue of mixed data sets, which are data sets that contain personal and non-personal data. And it does not propose a very clear distinction between these two categories of data. Lastly, two very important topics that were stressed by the European Data Protection Supervisor and that are very clearly addressed in the joint opinion of the European Data Protection Board and of the European Data Protection Supervisor on this Data Governance Act, which are from the 10th of March of this year. And those 2 points are the data altruism, which is a definition, which is a concept that the DGA introduces. And it is basically the voluntary data sharing without any compensation for purposes of general interest, for example, scientific research. But the problem at the DGA, it's not very clear in terms of the kind of protection that will be given to this data that will be used in the context of this data altruism. It is quite unclear if the data will be anonymized. If that is the case, this might be problematic. For example, here in Portugal, most of the companies struggle with trying to understand what is the difference between pseudonymized data and anonymized data. So if this concept of anonymized data is going to be used and explored in other initiatives of the EU, it's very important that small companies are aware and medium-sized companies are aware exactly what are anonymized data and what are the difference between anonymized data and pseudonymized data. And it's also unclear, of course, of how the data will be anonymized. Nevertheless, in this joint opinion, the European Data Protection Supervisor and the European Data Protection Board stressed something that for me is very clear, that is when the data subject is allowing the use of his or her data in the context of data altruism, it cannot be waiving the right to data protection. And this is stated very clearly in this joint opinion, and of course that I agree. And lastly, the second issue that should be clarified, and it's one issue that I believe that my colleagues will discuss later on their presentations, is that the DGA introduces a new entity, the European Data Innovation Board, but it is unclear about the kind of dialogue that this board will have with data protection authorities, with national data protection authorities. So what are, in my view, the three main consequences of the lack of consistency between the DGA and the GDPR? Legal uncertainty for stakeholders, complexity of the EU legal framework, and the most important, in my view, is that the DGA cannot be a way to weaken the protection ensured by the GDPR by creating an ambiguous exception that can help organizations bypass the application of existing rules. And this is it for my first intervention. Thank you, Professor Pinar, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues.
Thank you very much, and for your very interesting speech. And now is Professor Georgios Giannopoulos speech. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor. I'm trying to share my screen here. And thank you, first of all, Google, and of course, the European supervisor, all the representatives of the respected representatives of our universities, and of course, the members of the board and our distinguished guests in this conference and in this effort. Just a few words as of who we are. The University of Athens is one of the oldest in Europe, dates back to 1837. We rank 41st in the world, 10th in Europe, first in Greece. That's not something unofficial, it's official from the Google Scholar citations. The university is committed to research and to advanced work regarding all aspects of development. We have around 70,000 students, 43 undergraduate programs, more than 200 postgraduate programs, and within that institution we have established the Laboratory of Law and Informatics. Well, that's not the whole building. We only have the top floor of that. We are researching all aspects of law and new technologies. We have PhD and postdoctoral students. We have a lot of research projects, and we offer a lot of services. Nowadays, because of the COVID situation and because of the GDPR, we are acting as the data protection officer for the National Health Organization in Greece, who is the organization which is handling the COVID situation in Greece. We have conducted data protection impact assessments for the Ministry of Education regarding education at a distance, so, via tele-education. We are also advising the Ministry of Digital Governance and so on. And within these activities, it was a great opportunity that was given to us by Google to go into this area of data governance. Now, I will speak a little bit about platforms and regulation. And we have agreed with the other colleagues not to touch the GDPR rights for the moment. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about platforms and regulation. What do we have up to now? We have the Electronic Commerce Directive, which dates back to 2000. And on top of that, we start with a lot of acronyms. We have the GDPR, we have the e-privacy regulation. Okay, here we are waiting for the new one to come, and we are waiting for that something like 10 years or so. We have this last Portuguese intervention, which in the beginning of the year we hope that would end the situation and that we would have a new e-privacy regulation. It hasn't happened until now. We have the DSM, another weird acronym that stands for Digital Single Market. It's the change in the area of copyright, and actually that's why I have the prelude going into the Electronic Commerce Directive, because this is the piece of legislation already affecting and changing the Electronic Commerce Directive. We have the supply of digital content and digital services, Directive 770, and we have the platforms to business regulation, regulation 1150. All these weird acronyms and weird numbers as of where we stand. We had the Electronic Commerce Directive. We are moving towards more obligations to the platforms, more obligations to the intermediaries with all these pieces of legislation. But apart from that, we have the proposals. An awful lot of proposals, and I think Professor Zenkovic is going to talk a little bit more into detail for each one of them. We have the DSA, the Digital Services Act, we have the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, we have the DGA already. Maria de Grazia has spoken about that. These are planned for the future. The first one is again amending the Electronic Commerce Directive. The other one complements, does not change, does not eliminate the platform to business regulation. And on top of that, we have artificial intelligence regulation, standalone proposal for a regulation which characterizes the dangers that come out from artificial intelligence applications. Have we forgotten something? Maybe. How about sectoral legislation? We have the payments directives, we have competition, we have gambling, and so on. And what next? Well, are you dazzled by the stars? So am I. I am teaching the subject, and I have great difficulties in finding a method to explain to my students how all these different pieces of legislation come together. At the end of the day, question, do we really need that overregulation? Okay. If the answer is no, then we must at some point propose other types of control. Self-regulation, like for example, the GDPR is proposing. Co-regulation, what is going to happen with all the certification schemes? If this is the story, if the certification scheme is working properly, how many different stickers will we need for a properly working platform? Well, personally, I think that we need less regulation and more trust in the business model, but that's for the future to see. On the other hand, if the answer is yes, and we do need that over-regulation, who is going to impose all these different rules? How many authorities will be required? From all the stars that I have shown you, each one of them, each piece of legislation prevents for a separate authority overlooking or imposing the particular regulation. At the end of the day, what sort of governance will be needed? For which data? Well, I don't have the answer to that, but at the end of the day, will we need another regulator for all these regulators? Well, I do not have the answers for that. Well, I don't have them right now, but these questions are an indication as of which ways our research, given the opportunity that Google has given to our board, they show the way that we'll move. They show the way that our research will try to find answers to all these questions, or at least to provide guidelines as of the interconnection of all these different pieces of legislation. Among us, we had a discussion. Of course, the problem of the European Court of Justice of how far can intervene in solving these questions. I was saying that among our board, we had an agreement not to mention, not to go into the GDPR, but I'm afraid I have to stress your attention to the title of the particular regulation, because we always focus on the protection of personal data, and we forget the second part of the regulation, which is for the free movement of such data. And okay, we pay attention to the rights and the protection of data, but also enterprises, organizations, platforms must work on that data and must establish this free movement of such data. And that's the only possible stable guideline that I can give for the moment, around which our research will focus within this particular initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Giannopoulos. And now, Professor Vincenzo Senusenkovic, you have the floor.
Thanks to everybody. I was very I took notes like a student, the first year student with Professor Wojcicki, who his presentation indicating a certain amount of critical remarks on what is going on at the European level, and I think these criticisms, doubts are shared not only by the European Data Protection Supervisor, but also by many others. My very brief presentation somehow complements what Professor Giannopoulos has just done, but I will see it from a slightly different perspective. If I can manage to share my screen, here we are. This is it. I trust. Can you see Can you see? Yes, I hope. I trust you have to see. Sorry, let's go. What is the title? Data governance or data chaos, and the risk of hyper-regulation.
Professor Yiannopoulos was very polite and said over-regulation. I think we are way beyond over-regulation, hyper-regulation. So what have we had in these last months? I mean, we all work in this field and we are attentive to what's going on. We've had the Data Governance Act, the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, e-privacy regulation, artificial intelligence regulation. This is more or less from November to March. We've had all these, and we're talking of hundreds of pages and hundreds of recitals and hundreds of articles. From a legal point of view, it is extremely confusing. All these texts, obviously, they add to existing digital legislation, GDPR, cybersecurity regulation, B2B directive, which Professor Yiannopoulos has already mentioned. But these are not the only legal environment which the collection use of transfer data. And when I speak of data, I mean all data, because there's a tendency to think that data has to do with personal data, but the data is of all different kinds, and it's very difficult to distinguish between personal data and non-personal data. So what do we have? We have to do with consumer protection, unfair and aggressive commercial practices, and antitrust concerns. And Professor Yiannopoulos has mentioned others. Just think of the Payment Services Directive. So we have two main issues: collision of substantive norms, and Professor Yiannopoulos has mentioned already some of these aspects, and then conflicts between regulatory authorities. I will focus on this last aspect because it is very important, because if there are conflicts, then you must find someone that solves these conflicts. But then if there is a conflict between authorities, is the regulator of the regulators, as has been suggested? I don't know, but this is a very delicate issue. So what do we have? I've just made a list of regulatory authorities that overlap each other somehow. They are, obviously we have the national data protection authorities, but we have also the European Data Protection Board, which has a very important and compliance role in consistency role in Europe. Then we have obviously the European Data Protection Supervisor. Then we have national telecommunication authorities, and as a significant part of data goes through telecommunication networks, that too is again something that is very relevant. National media authorities, I mean Netflix, just to mention the case, I mean that is media, audiovisual media, but they thrive on data and therefore on the use of data of viewers. Then we have the BEREC, which has again a very important role in Europe. National consumer protection authorities, I will come back to this. National competition authorities, NCAs, national cybersecurity certification authorities, and just yesterday the Commission said that it's going to propose for a joint cyber unit. It is not all that together clear what it would mean quick response to certain emergencies, but obviously knowing how things go in Brussels, you put a cyber unit, and that cyber unit will obviously have a very significant role. So here we have, I made just a list of nine regulatory authorities that have to do with data. Some obviously are focused mainly on data. Others are incidentally involved in regulation of data, but we find constantly overlapping. And then we have new authorities or new competences for existing authorities. Sorry, there's a typo here. Data Governance Act, that Professor de Grasse has mentioned it, enforcement is conferred upon the national competent authority under the supervision of a European Data Innovation Board. What is this Data Innovation Board? what is it going to regulate? And then artificial intelligence regulation is, in my very limited understanding, being someone who was born not, well, mid of the 20th century, so I'm way back. But we have, first of all, we have this artificial intelligence regulatory sandbox. Now, I thought sandboxes were places where children used to play, but I don't understand what it means from a lawyer's point of view. Well, the European Data Protection Supervisor said, what does data altruism means? Well, when we're talking of regulatory sandboxes, I mean, it is, if I may say so, it's sheer nonsense. I mean, lawyers don't use terms as sandboxes. We don't have, in our vocabulary, we don't have sandboxes. Sandboxes are for, we can use them for marketing, for doing something else, but not in the legal context. Then we have the European Artificial Intelligence Board. Then we have national competent authorities, and then the regulation says, well, but these aspects will be governed by the market surveillance authorities on the basis of regulation 1020 of 2019. So, I mean, if you look, who's going to sort of supervise artificial intelligence? Well, or there's some very smart algorithm, and then we can do without these authorities, or it is very, very complex. I mean, as not only as an academic, but as a practicing lawyer, it is really a nightmare not knowing who is competent to decide certain conflicts when collision of norms arise. And I just to point out that this is not something theoretical, like, because it's easy, you're criticizing and say, no, but this is going to be a great mess. I just want to point out that we have this conflict. It's quite obvious. All the actions taken by the national competition authorities or the Commission against Facebook and Google. Now, I'm not discussing of the merits. I'm just sort of trying to see who is competent. Is it antitrust versus data protection? Are they two different worlds, or is it antitrust and data protection? So should these two authorities work together and analyze cases the same? This is not something theoretical, it is extremely practical, and we have a whole lot of cases all around Europe on this case. Here we have this other preliminary question which has been submitted on the 22nd of December last year, 701 of 20, Avis out of the meeting from the Austrian Consumer Protection Authority. Here, what do we have? A collision between general terms and conditions in car hiring. So, are they compliant with unfair commercial practices, and the information provided on data processing, which apparently is compliant with the GDPR. So, just to show you that this is a scenario which is not hypothetical, but will bring up to an enormous amount of problems. I sort of follow day by day what's going on in the European Court of Justice, and I see that soon there will be more decisions in the field of data protection, or anyhow data governance, data protection, than in the field of state aid, which is quite impressive, which means that there's a great deal of uncertainty. So just to point out that from an academic point of view, if this Southern Europe, South Europe Google data governance chair is working, is trying to understand and try to put a little bit of order, theoretical order, in a very disorderly context, which inevitably will not help anybody, will not help users, individuals, companies, industry, and obviously institutions, if we are in the field of case. Having said that, I thank you a lot, and I give back the floor to our chairman, Professor Pignat.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Senkovic. Thank you very much, Maria Grassa, Georgios, Vincenzo. Well, I think that there is a common point of view. We are talking about a scenario of lack of consistency. Maria made reference to this lack of consistency of legal uncertainty, over-regulation. Georgios mentioned this over-regulation, and even data chaos or hyper-regulation. My master at the university, Professor Garcia Enterria, a few years ago, not dealing with data protection, talk about motorized legislation. Perhaps we are in front of a sort of motorized legislation, and the question is this the best scenario, the best possible scenario for fundamental rights and for the legal security, for the market, and for these two topics that you talking about, Georgios, the fundamental right of data protection and also the free movement of data in Europe, and also in a global scenario. And there is also a question, and what kind of regulation can we have? Because there is not a lot of proposals, regulations, directives, regulations, proposals, the new name, the acts, the European acts, but also the relationship between regulation and self-regulation, and the relationship between the European regulation and the international regulation. What kind of relationships could be between regulation and self-regulation in this scenario of hyper-regulation? What could be the place for the self-regulation, and what kind of self-regulation, if needed, can we have? How can you act this relationship between regulation and self-regulation?
If I may, Professor Pinar, I think that the kind of self-regulation that we are seeing in a couple of these legal initiatives, it's similar to the one that we find in the GDPR. Because in the GDPR, I wouldn't say that there is 100% self-regulation. We have the accountability principle, which introduces a different way to regulate, a different legal structure, which relies a lot in companies and in the ability that they have to manage risk. But then the GDPR also introduced some kind of public control, let's call it like this, from the authority. And for example, a very good example of this self-regulation with public intervention, I would call it like this, is the prior consultation after the performance of a data protection impact assessment. Because we have a component of self-regulation, which says that in certain circumstances, the controllers need to perform a data protection impact assessment. But then, if the results are inconclusive, or if they have questions, they have the possibility to ask the data protection authority in that prior consultation. So I wouldn't call it exactly self-regulation. I would call it self-regulation with a public control, or at least a public input from data protection authorities. Another example are the mechanisms for certification and the codes of conduct that also need to have an approval, a public approval, besides the input from organizations and from companies.
Professor Piñar, you are muted. Professor, just Professor Sendosekovic or Giannopoulos about this relationship between self-regulation and...
I just wanted to add that one line that, okay, the model is that one, the model of GDPR, not full self-regulation, but in a way, the accountability principle transfers all the burden to the organization. We cannot have, you have been in the area of data protection and you know better, but each authority in each country cannot have so many agents to oversee each organization. I mean, we cannot have one policeman over each organization. And I think that's the proper way to move forward. But the problem starts when we have an awful lot of legislation, this overregulation, many different aspects. How many compliances must each organization conduct in a way?
Well, there are also another questions. How can be the relationship between European and national regulation? I mean, what, in your opinion, is a better way to adopt directives or regulations? Since it seems that now the European institutions are adopting more regulations after the GDPR, more regulation than directives. Are we going to really an unification of the regulation, the legal framework in Europe with regulations, or since there are so many regulations and so many different laws, despite the European regulation, not directive, it's almost impossible to arrive to this unification of the legislation in Europe?
If I must just say something, obviously when we are talking of digital technologies, these digital technologies do not know barriers. And one of the main reasons why I feel the European Union is taking all these decisions is somehow what is called the European fortress. We are building a European fortress through norms and somehow defending ourselves if we feel if this is the threat from what comes from abroad. So this is, I would think that inevitably there are regulations, but I'd just like to point out that all these pieces of legislation, all of them now invariably, whatever the field, I'm not talking only of digital technologies, always have delegate legislation to the Commission. Now this is significant transfer powers to the Commission. So what happens? We have a very lengthy process in enacting this legislation. It passes through the Commission, hearings, Parliament, then the Council, and this and that. And then once this is put there, then we have a blank sort of carte blanche given to the Commission, which is, I don't know. I mean, I'm just I have my doubts that this will increase the favor of European citizens towards European institutions. I'm deeply attached to Europe, the European Union, but I think that if you go too far away and you say I will decide everything in the sort of in the best interest of citizens from Cyprus or Finland, from Portugal to Romania, well, there may be some unpleasant surprises from a political point of view. So I think that also this aspect has to be considered, and carefully considered. Doesn't mean it's not a threat. It's just you must take into account also acceptability of this enormous shift of powers from states to the Commission, not the Parliament, not the Council, the Commission.
Yeah. There are also two questions. The first one, what is the place of the European Court of Justice? Since we have now a lot of decisions, 2 days ago, about administrative sanctions and data. 1 week ago about international data flows and the position of the supervisory authorities. Is in this chaos, data chaos, is the European Court of Justice going to have a central point in the definition of the legal framework? Yes, Georgios.
Not, because the situation is very complicated, and history has shown that the judges are not keen to take the situation on their shoulders. I mean, from the time of Pro Musicae, which is notorious for its disambiguation. I mean, even the orator in Delphi would have found something more clear to say. Vincenzo is laughing. Sometimes my students ask me, what is the morale of the Pro Musicae? The morale is that the judges have put the burden on national legislation, on the national justice system. It was like saying, you take the decision which thing prevails, data protection or copyright. That was the story then. We have similar situations, and if all this legislation is going to come into force, we are going to have more situations like that. I mean, more conflicts of fundamental rights. And up to now, the court has shown that they don't want to take they don't want to put forward a straightforward answer as of which right prevails. I don't know if that is good or not, but I think that the situation is going to become more and more difficult for the national judge.
Professor Piñar, if I can add something, we have two very good examples of what Professor Georgios just said from data protection cases. For example, the recent Schrems 2 case, where the court decided to mention the famous supplementary measures, and it did not clarify what those measures were, and this was chaos for a lot of companies, because suddenly we have the ECG saying that companies should adopt supplementary measures, and they were unaware of what those measures could be. Now we have the guidance from the European Data Protection Board. And the other example was the second Google case regarding the right to be listed, which the court also said that the data protection authorities or national courts should take the final decision. So I think that these two cases are very good examples of what Professor Georgios just said, because the court did not want it clearly, did not seek a compromise, did not want to clarify 100% what was being decided.
Another question, perhaps for all of us. How is the relationship between general regulation and special lex specialis, lex generalis? Is the GDPR to be the lex generalis? But since the lex specialis is going to apply preferentially to general regulation. What can we do with all these regulations? What is going to be the place of the GDPR? In specifically with the e-privacy regulation, with the proposal of e-privacy regulation. Professor Xenosenkovich, or since you are a professor of comparative law.
Professor Da Grassa, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. I was just going to say that I think that the GDPR is the piece of law that establishes the secondary rules of the right to data, the fundamental right to data protection, and as such, it should be the general law and the privacy regulation. I think it will be the lex specialis towards the GDPR. I think that will be the case, and probably that will happen with all the other initiatives. But Professor Vincenzo might have a more qualified view on this.
I really don't know. I just wait and see. I really have a very skeptical approach. I really don't understand. I mean, for me, everything is e-privacy. So, I mean, it's the lex specialis would tend to swallow up the lex generalis. I mean, this is, in my view, I mean, everything goes on telecommunication networks. Everything is collected through telecommunication networks. So I don't know, but I'm very happy I'm not in some institution where I have to decide this, whether it's a data protection authority, because as you know, when it comes to e-privacy, well, and we have telecommunication networks involved, we have a dual competence of two authorities, the Data Protection Authority and the Telecommunications Authority, who not always agree. And so this again will be a sort of a significant issue of conflict. But I mean, I think we put lots of topics on the floor, and just show that we can only live and learn what is going to happen if these new pieces of legislation actually do enter into force. I mean, maybe they're not going to enter, or they're going to enter into force only very, very much later. So we still have to see.
Well, we all are almost on time. There are a lot of questions. Another one very, very interesting for Professor Giannopoulos. If you could specify a little bit more on the relationship between data protection, fundamental right, and free movement of data in European Union. But unfortunately, another one about the relationship between law and ethics, and another one about the possibility of have a sort of codification for the future after these numerous regulations, directives, and proposals. Do we need perhaps a sort of codification of for the personal data regime in the future, since we are going to have a lot of very different regulations? Well, we are now on time. We have to start with the second panel. Thank you very much, Maria da Grassa, Vincenzo, Georgios. Thank you very much to everybody. I think it was a very, very interesting panel. There are a lot of questions, open questions to think about in the future, and this is one of the key points of this chair on data governance. Thank you very much, and now we are going to start with the next panel on international data flows. Thank you very much. Well, we can start with the second panel, an amazing second panel, or on international data flows. One, without any doubt, one of the key points, the key topics, the key problems of data protection law in not only in Europe, but at a global level. In fact, we are talking about international data flows, not only between Europe and the States, but overall between these very important places, geopolitical and sociological and economic places. We have an amazing panel with Bojana Bellamy, Alex Greenstein, and Ralph Sauer. Well, everybody knows Bojana Bellamy. Bojana is the president of Hampton Andrews Court Center for Information Policy Leadership, CIPL, a preeminent global information policy think tank in London, Washington, and Brussels. Bojana works with global business and technology leaders, regulators, policy and lawmakers to shape global data policy and practice and develop thought leaderships and best practices for responsible and trusted use of data in the fourth industrial regulations, with over 25 years of experience in privacy and data policy and compliance. We worked together years ago when I used to be Spanish data protection director. Thank you very much, Bojana, for attending again a panel of the Google Chair. Alex Greenstein is the director of Privacy Shield, and the U.S. Department of Commerce, has served as director of the EU and U.S. Privacy Shield program since July 2019. So Alex knows very well. Is one of the person that knows better privacy shield and the negotiations between the European Union and the state. In this role, he's responsible for management and administration of the privacy shield program, as well as policy regarding transatlantic data privacy, data flows, and digital trade issues. Prior to joining the Commerce Department, Alex served as senior advisor in the Office of the Coordinator for Communications and Internet Policy in the U.S. Department of State. From 2015 to 2016, I served as director for the European Union, Southern Europe, and European Economic Affairs at the National Security Council, and oversaw negotiation of the EU and US privacy seal. Holds a BA and International Economics and Russian Studies from George Washington University, and has pursued graduate level economics coursework through the US Department of State's Foreign Service Economics course. He is a term member of the Council of Foreign Relations. And Ralph Sauer is Deputy Head for International Data Flows and Protection. Ralph has been leading our work on the recently adopted standard contractor clauses, also the Korea adequacy negotiations, the negotiations of the additional protocol to the Budapest Convention, negotiation regarding the States and European Union data flows. So Ralph is also a very specialized person that knowing the problems, the most important problems regarding international data flows. Well, thank you very much to Bojana, Alex, Ralph for attending this conference, for attending this first international conference of the new South European Union data governance, Google data governance chairs. First, I want to remember to the attendees that they can make answers, questions to the speakers, and now we can start with this panel. And Bojana, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jose Luis. It really is great to see you virtually. It's a pleasure to be at your newly established South EU chair conference as well. And of course, Alex and Ralph, very good to share this with you. I don't know, we've shared this panel so many times. I will try to be original if I can, but it's difficult. Because, data flows is something that we have been speaking for very many years. And I always start talking whenever I do these panels of data flows, that when I started in data privacy many years ago, 27 probably now, my first piece of work was, in fact, how do you enable data flows in a big multinational company? And I was working on that consulting project. And, a year later, we're still dealing with this issue. And in fact, we haven't solved it. It's becoming more complex in so many ways. We at CIPL have been following, it is actually one of our work streams at CIPL. We are absolutely keen to ensure and to provide as much as possible support for trusted and responsible data flows. We think data flows are critical for the economy, they're critical for the progress of the society, they're critical for the fourth industrial revolution that we are living. And after this year of COVID, it is absolutely essential that we are able to share data for the benefits and for the health and protection. I was speaking recently to Association of Biotech in the US, and they have told me that And Ralph, this is terrible, but since GDPR came into force, there's been only one single agreement on medical research data sharing between the public health equivalent in the US and the EU institutions. So not private companies and pharma, but sort of at public health level. And I think that is so debilitating to hear, right? And you ask yourself, why is this the case? And the answers are many. The answers are it's really become very complex. There is lots of misconceptions. The data flows can't happen with GDPR or some other laws. And of course, we have had Schrems case, which hasn't helped at all. But it is a big topic for many countries and many companies. I would say it's probably one of the most important and top three, perhaps, commercial, strategic, and compliance issues for companies that operate globally. It is not just the EU that regulates data transfers. Regulation of data flows is happening across the globe. But of course, nobody quite has got the same approach. Many copy the sort of GDPR style, but with a little bit more flexibility, with a less prescription, which of course is helpful. Some have got the accountability style of governing data flows, where it doesn't really matter. You don't prescribe, but you make sure that accountability flows with data. Canada is in that group. US to some extent. And of course, the APEC cross-border privacy rule regime and the countries that kind of adhere to that. And then many are in the mix as well between sort of GDPR style and something else. And I think what we at CIPL have been really trying to do is to bring as much as possible convergence in the way countries look at the data flow mechanisms and where they do regulate data flows. We don't want to see different standard contractual clauses, right? That's problematic for a company who wants to sign, ensure global data flows. We want binding corporate rules that have actually worked very well in Europe to also be adopted elsewhere. We would like to see kind of bridges built between cross-border privacy rules and certifications under GDPR and some other countries as well. So, we really would like to see more convergence. However, that's really what we would like to see. That's what everywhere where I go, everybody tells me it's an absolute imperative from governmental perspective. G7 just talked about data flows with trust. G20 was having the same agenda, but it isn't like that. At the moment, I think we are in a bit of a fractured state, and I'm, maybe we in Europe are to blame for that. Doesn't really matter where the blame lies, who starts this, but it is since about a year ago, when of course we have had this famous or infamous Schrems decision, which of course is a constitutional decision and has to be respected, that data flows have become a really complex issue. Before I go into some of the specificities, I would also like to point out that globally, and I do a lot of work globally, there is a lot of discussion. How do we make sure we ensure global data flows? How do we make sure we, for example, our industries in no matter what countries are able to use AI, right? To have this data to be able to build the right algorithms which are non-biased, non-discriminatory, which actually are diverse and fair as well. So, everybody wants more data. And I think that's kind of become part of every government's policy. How do we open data? How do we have more data? But on the other hand, there is this protectionism strain, and that sort of says, well, we would like to have lots of data, but keep it in the country, right? So you see countries like India, a bit of China, a bit of Russia, Indonesia, Vietnam, trying to sort of have these kind of data localization requirements, which are really worrying global businesses and certainly global research community, the use of data for good and so on. And so, in some ways, we really have to combat that data localization. And so, what has happened in Europe now? We were never in Europe about data localization. We were never about data sovereignty. But unfortunately, and Ralph, again, this is how it's perceived around the world. The Schrems discourse has actually made, and of course, some of the announcements by some of the commissioners and others sort of at EU level and some of the member states have sort of elevated this data localization issue much more, because now other countries are saying, well, look, Europe is localizing data as well. We have got Schrems, which says you can't take data unless there is a essential equivalence and protection from the surveillance, which is very difficult to achieve. That the reality of the market is that that market forces are now trying to construe data localization cloud services, data localized cloud services, and data localization as a solution to some of these problems. And that's not what Europe is about. Europe isn't about that. And then finally, there is also this digital governance and act, which again provides for non-personal data, kind of data sovereignty. So, there's these mixed messages coming from Europe, and I think our partners, the companies around the world are really a bit confused. And I think if we really want to fight data localization, which I think we all do, and I believe the Commission does as well, we have to really have very consistent messages, because sometimes things that we do are seen as protectionism as well. And this is just to say that this whole data flow has become more complex. Companies are in the middle of these bigger geopolitical discourses where data is becoming a weapon of industrial policy, where data sovereignty is something that is being quoted by politicians. And so, it really is it's kind of difficult as a leader or lawyer in a company to decide what you do and how do you combat all of that. So anyway, these are some general comments which are not quite general. I mean, they're perhaps a little bit more specific, but I wanted to kind of to raise that. Can I just very briefly now reflect on this 1 year post Schrems? I mean, it has been a very reactive year, because Schrems has elevated this topic to the level where nobody wanted it really. We are too busy actually. I would rather see companies implement accountability. I would rather see them do privacy by design, deal with the new technologies, facial recognition, use of AI, then sort of deal with data flows, papyrology around data flows, where harm is still not clear. We're still not clear where there is harm to people when data is flowing, particularly intergroup. But anyway, it has been elevated, and this is again something we should think about, how actually the NGOs in Europe have now taken on the agenda from the regulators, from the Commission, from the DPOs, and setting the agenda as to what we should be talking about and doing, as opposed to us setting the agenda in terms of our regulatory priorities, our companies' priorities, dealing with the real risks and harms to individuals. So I will just say that it has been a really difficult year, I think, quite reactive. But there's some good news, right? The good news is that we have had a new set of standard contractual clauses, which were done by the Commission for really several reasons. First, to address Schrems, of course, but also judgment and requirements, but also to adapt this sort of old-fashioned contractual model to really more flexible and more modern data flows. Now, whether that is going to be the effect, I do not know. It all depends how the market takes on the new SECs. I mean, they certainly are better, more flexible, can be used in a modular fashion, but I suspect the market is going to take a few years until we settle and start using these new SECs in the way that they're meant to be, because there's a lot of different points of view, misconceptions, different interests between controllers, processors, importers, exporters, and so you could see that there is going to be quite a lot of market movement until things settle again. So there is going to be quite a lot of work for privacy, officers and compliance teams, and of course lawyers as ever, to spend time setting these new contractual clauses. And just for those who are not aware of the timing, the new clauses will come into force in September, but actually there is a kind of a grace period for existing contracts and existing standard contractual clauses until December 2022. So by then, all of the contracts will have to be upgraded to the new system. So certainly we have got more legal certainty with the SECs, but much more compliance burden, much more for companies to actually do to ensure they can comply with what they write in these contracts, right? That's really critical. Second, we have had the EDPB recommendation on Schrems, that this is now, of course, the final recommendation after the first one came out in December and was really heavily criticized for the lack of the risk-based approach. I think it's what we see now is better. It is still very cautious. The DPAs have got huge amounts on their plate because that's what the court gave them huge powers and ability to actually consider each data flow and question each data flow, which of course they will be using as well. But the recommendations are better. There is more risk-based approach embedded in the recommendations, and in that way they're more aligned with the SECs, because the SECs really in the first instance, in the first draft, were drafted with the risk-based approach incorporated, and the board just ignored that. So again, recommendation better, but we also worry. I mean, when you still read those examples on cloud service providers or intragroup transfers that are still shown as not good enough, just in kind of as examples. I kind of don't. I'm wondering, have they just forgotten to correct that, or why is it still there? So I still have got questions. The third piece of good news is that, of course, the US and EU are working very hard to try to come up with a sort of solution, new negotiated transatlantic deal for data. And I don't need to talk about that. Ralph and Alex will talk about that. It is much needed. We really need to ensure this happens, because I don't know what the alternative is. If we don't get this, the alternative is that some DPAs will be stopping data flows, and that means Europeans will not be able to use Facebook. And there's nothing Facebook can do, because it's inherent in Facebook to have data flows. If I want to be on Facebook and have friends and like things with people around the world, well, there has to be a data flow. And if you say this is always subject to interception and surveillance, well, Facebook has no option but to say we can't do this in Europe. We have to shut down. And that's not what anybody wants to do. And there's so many services like that, and that can't be the case, right? It can't be that this is the shutdown. So we need to create some solution, and maybe 80-20% is good enough. Maybe perfection is the enemy of the good in this case. And we can talk about that, but we may not be able to find absolutely perfection, but we have to find what in practice delivers what the Court of Justice wanted, and not what the formality and form says, or piece of paper. So that's kind of my kind of take on that. But there are some bad news. I'm afraid. Having looked at this year, I mean, I talked about the huge compliance burden now of dealing with data flows, which is kind of detracting from everything else privacy officers are doing, and that is really a shame. As I say, new SECs will take a long time to implement internally and externally. I mean, now we have to sort of go again into, every 2 years there's kind of major revamp of what we internally do to ensure data is flowing, which mechanisms we use. We have to get the budget, and for major companies, this is a huge thing. But for SMEs, this is a huge thing because they have to do this risk assessment now. So how are they going to at all assess the level of surveillance, and whether this is proportionate, whether the redress exists in a number of countries? I just do not know. I know the big companies who I work with have started doing these risk assessments. It's incredibly laborious a thing to do. There has to be some sort of shortcuts for them at some point, so that they will say these sort of things is okay, these sort of things will not be okay. You cannot do this for every transfer every day, because there are thousands of transfers every day. The second point is that the market is unsettled, and what I mean by that is that commercially, there's lots of discussion in negotiations about data localization and where's data, and for all of a sudden where data is matters hugely. So delays we see delays in negotiations and commercial agreements. We see crazy questions being asked left, right, and center. Of course, everybody's confused and there is no legal certainty. So this now, of course, impedes the ability of everybody, including European companies in particular, to do business. And this is not good. Now, what I think is happening, and I'm not happy about that, is that big service providers are starting to offer localized services, and that to me is not good because sometimes you just can't do that, and that doesn't work, right? The whole point is we're not supposed to rework the internet. We are supposed to gather rules that actually make sense for the internet. But this localized services, and you have heard Microsoft and Capgemini and Orange are entering into some agreement, OMV, cloud service provider with Google, to kind of allow European service provision. But even then, I really do question this because technically speaking, the US surveillance laws, even they've got long arm reach, right? So even if you are holding data in Europe, that is still accessible by virtue of your systems, network, and management to the US. So de facto, any US company will be compelled ultimately to supply data. Now, of course, the likes of Microsoft and big players will resist that, but keeping data in Europe and yet being a US company still doesn't. It's not a solution. It's just something that sounds better, it feels better, and certainly Conseil d'Etat in the two cases in France seems to agree with that, right? There's a bit of a less risk, and that's sort of what's happening now. Um, the bad news is also the data protection authorities are also sort of, even though the recommendations have just come now, they're taking their own action different from each other. We have had a suspension of data flows from Portugal for the sort of big health data. We have had German lender data protection authorities issuing questionnaire and asking companies how they're transferring data and really digging deep. We've had these two Conseil d'Etat good decisions, I think, which is good, right? Despite CNIL perhaps wanting this to go in a different direction. And we've had through Bavarian DPA, right, the email marketing case against suspension. So, and of course, Irish case is still there. Irish DPC by November may suspend, or in November may suspend data flows unless there is some kind of solution. And we've heard that EDPS, of course, has also looked into how European institutions are transferring data, and there seem to be some shortcomings there as well. So DPS have got a lot on their plate, and there's no doubt they're going to be using their powers. So what else can be done apart from the US and EU please getting together and trying to craft some solution? And I wonder whether the recent case from the European Court of Human Rights in the Sweden and the UK judgments, the two cases, may provide some interesting confirmation as to what really Europe looks for. And I know this is not the European Court of Justice, but I mean the two systems are intrinsically intrinsically intertwined, and it's the European Court of Human Rights that actually has set these precedents. And in these two cases, I mean, they have sort of confirmed that bulk surveillance is proportionate, even though it is infringement of privacy. It is acceptable infringement of privacy subject to 8 criteria. And if you look at these 8 criteria, and you look particularly the one around redress and authority, it talks about independent authority, effective. It doesn't talk about judicial authority, judicial redress. So I would just wonder whether this could help both US and EU side sort of come to something that kind of would work. The other question that I have got, and I don't know the answer for, is what do we do with the rest of the world? I mean, US is a list of, I think, all our problems. Data is flowing everywhere, non-stop, including countries who have signed the European Convention of Human Rights, but who don't have at all a good data protection record. So what do we do with the other countries? And I think that's going to be a much more difficult question for companies to overcome. And Ralph, I don't know, Commission, what is Commission going to do there? Do we go country by country to kind of decide on this? I just really do not know. Final point, I would like us still to not forget the ambition of wanting to have responsible data flows. Yes, the EU Commission is, of course, pushing on with their adequacy crusade, but that's slow and it doesn't really always work. So, can we use certifications under GDPR? Can we use, bridging with some other mechanisms, even if the other mechanisms need to improve? I would like us to turn to some positive, enabling work as opposed to all the time reacting to kind of firefighting to issues. And I think in that bucket is potentially also looking at the role of derogations. And I know there's a lot of discussion on this. I was always the one who used to say, well, derogation are the last resort, because what we want to do is we want to ensure accountability and protection of data. But I'm kind of wondering that in the moment where we are, where we really have a conflict of law, surveillance versus privacy, if companies have nothing else to do, can provide no other guarantees, despite supplementary measures, despite the SECs, maybe they have to also consider derogations, and maybe we should allow them to do that because they are in the law, right? They're there to be used. That still doesn't absolve them from complying with GDPR. They still have to comply with all of the principles, everything under GDPR, including in respect of the transfer. But in terms of the legal basis for transfer, derogation may work. I don't know. That's just I mean, we talked about this in our paper to the board and the commission in December, together with some other proposals. I kind of hear that discussion being held from here or there, but we have to think about that because I repeat, it's not about the US, it's about the rest of the world. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to hearing what my other panelists have to say. Thank you very much, Jose Luis.
Thank you very much to you, Bojana, for your interesting speech. And now, Alex, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for having me. And it's good to be here along with Bojana and Ralph. It's good to see you guys again. I hope to see you in person at some point as well. And yeah, no, I just sort of give some opening remarks here. I'll try to keep things brief because, I mean, this is an issue that, I mean, we've all spent so much time on and that I think everyone is sort of familiar with. One point that sort of, Bojana, I'd like to sort of echo is just sort of the difficulty in sort of quantifying sort of what is at risk here and sort of the benefits of sort of like, data transfers, because I mean, this is something that my background is sort of in economics, and so this is something that sort of speaks to me, but it's like really hard to quantify. I mean, the impact of sort of the invalidation of privacy shield and sort of potential impacts on data transfers. But I mean, this has really very concrete impacts, and its privacy shield and data transfers sort of underpin basically the entire sort of US-EU transatlantic economic relationship, which is $7.1 trillion. I mean, when you look at sort of investment, when you look at like goods trade, you look at digital trade, and a lot of those things, I mean, it's very hard to do those things if you can't transfer personal data. It's hard for sort of customers in Europe to use the services of their choice, that many of which are sort of in the United States. I mean, it's hard for European companies to manage their operations at factories they own in the United States if they can't transfer personal data. And so this is a very foundational issue that we really need to get right. And that sort of is why this was definitely on the agenda for the recent sort of US-EU summit, and why this was discussed in that context, and was very sort of draw everyone's attention there to the summit statement, which included language on our shared commitment to sort of promoting data flows. Moreover, sort of our Secretary of Commerce, Raimondo, was in Brussels as well for the summit and had some very good meetings with Commissioner Renders, with Vice President Jourova, and certainly this was a topic of discussion there. And we are sort of continuing our discussions and negotiations with the European Commission on an enhanced privacy shield framework. We recognize that this is the Schrems II decision has created a great deal of uncertainty in the marketplace and has really made things difficult for companies in terms of it's unclear sort of what the ground rules are for transferring data, and certainly has brought into question sort of their ability to use the SEC. We definitely welcome the revisions to the SECs, and then also sort of closely looking at the European Data Protection Board's recent guidance on data transfers in light of Schrems II. But we also sort of recognize that we need to make progress on a negotiated solution for a privacy shield enhancement that will restore stability to data transfers and enable companies to move data with assurance. In the short term, I'd also draw people's attention to a white paper that the U.S. government put out back in September of 2020, which describes some of the safeguards and limitations around government access to data. I mean, we recognize that this is not sort of a silver bullet, but it is our hope that this does provide some additional information and transparency and will help companies make the best case possible to continue using the standard contractual clauses for data transfers, given the sort of fact that Privacy Shield is no longer a valid transfer mechanism. However, it is sort of important to note that there's a lot of companies who have been impacted who are small and medium enterprises. Privacy Shield is 75% SMEs. And those companies generally don't have the resources to conduct sort of a deep sort of risk assessment of sort of how likely they are to have sort of concerns around government access to data, and also certainly they will have a lot of there will be a steep learning curve there in terms of doing the sort of risk assessment that is contemplated. And so that's another reason that we really do want to work with our partners in the Commission to put in place an enhanced privacy shield that enables them to make those transfers and also provides greater assurance about government access to data in this context, and provides and fully addresses the concerns raised by the Court of Justice in the Schrems 2 case. I can't go into details about sort of our ongoing negotiations, but I can say this sort of is a high priority for the U.S. government, and that from sort of day one when sort of the Biden administration came into office, this has been getting extremely high-level attention, and the Secretary of Commerce and everyone on down is very much focused on these negotiations and getting this right. And also, I guess I would say one other final point. I mean, I think that this is something where oftentimes it's presented as being sort of a major sort of rift between sort of the United States and Europe. But I do think that sort of we and Europe are closer on these issues than it's thought popularly. I mean, the United States and the European Union share the same fundamental values. We respect privacy, and we have different approaches to this. The United States has a different legal system, but we are committed to sort of bridging those differences. And I think sort of fundamentally we are on the same page here. And so it's important that we focus on finding ways to sort of work together on this issue, because certainly we all believe in sort of limitations and on government access to data. And that stands in stark contrast to authoritarian states out there who have no limitations on government access to data. But yeah, I think I'll leave it there, and definitely appreciate any questions, and hand it off to Ralph.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. And now, Ralph, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, and first of all, thank you for the invitation, and hello to everyone who's listening into this. I'm in the uncomfortable position that I come at the end, which of course means that I'm tempted to react to a lot of the points raised, and that I think concerns in particular Bojana, with whom I traditionally I think disagree on a number of points, in particular how she presents the situation in Europe. maybe also just to say that I'm a bit surprised sometimes that the focus is so much on Europe when there's developments in other parts of the world as well, including concerns with respect to government access. I mean, where governments take steps to address that issue, such as in the United States, for instance, and in many other places around the world, or the fact that probably the biggest, let's say, divergence of privacy regimes we currently actually don't see globally, but probably within the United States at state level. But that somehow never makes it to these kinds of talks, whereas other types of differences seem to matter much more for some of us. I mean, let me just say that up front, I think there's a couple of things where we certainly agree, and I in particular agree with Alex on a number of points that concerns, of course, the importance of data flows, which indeed is an inescapable fact, I would say, of our digital economy, of our interconnected world, not just for trade, but of course also for cooperation between public authorities, for social interaction, for fighting the pandemic, and many other things. So I think there's no question about that, and I think there is no question about the commitment of Europe to data flows, and that's, I think, where we have the first point of divergence, I think, with some of the things that Bojana has said, because I think if there is a bloc such as the European Union that is committed to fighting data protectionism, then certainly I think it is us. If there's someone that does that, then I think it's the European Union. We have a very clear policy on that in our trade negotiations, as certainly Bojana knows. So we are directly fighting data protectionism, and I think we should not confuse data sovereignty, what is sometimes labeled as data sovereignty, with data protectionism. And I think that's very clear also if you look into the DSA or DGA, so the Data Governance Act or Data Service Act. It's about ensuring a level playing field. It's about ensuring that we are also able to use data in Europe, that we have the infrastructure for that we manage also to keep access to data, but it's not limited to companies or players from Europe, but it's open. But those who participate from the outside should play by the same rules. That's the kind of concepts that are behind our new draft rules. They're not yet adopted on what's sometimes called data sovereignty, and then an assertive approach to certain values that we cherish and that we try to defend. But that's not to be confused, I think, with data protectionism. So to say we share certainly the view on the importance of data flows. We know about the importance of the transatlantic. It would be good if we could. So maybe someone has the mic open.
Please, Alex, could you mute?
So that's that we certainly share, and we also believe indeed that we share important values with a partner such as the United States, and that's why we believe we should indeed be able to come to a new arrangement, but we shouldn't paper over certain differences either, and they do exist. They have been pointed out by the Court of Justice, and these things need to be addressed, and I think we will not get around that if we want to have a new stable foundation for transatlantic data flows. So that is something that we are committed to work on. but we have to work through the issues. So if Guyana says that we shouldn't be stuck on formalities, or maybe perfection is the enemy of the good. I mean, as a slogan, that's fine, but I think what matters is that we get to the bottom of the issues that the Court of Justice has identified and address them this time, because we have two Schrems judgments already, and certainly we are not going to have a third one, or if there is a third one, then it should be a positive one that upholds hopefully a future adequacy decision. Let me also say that I don't share the view that this sort of bleak view on what's happening in the world, that we have increasing fragmentation. I think we see the opposite. We are engaged with many countries around the world and regional organizations. We see increasing convergence. There are some parts of the world where we don't see that, but that's those parts of the world which I think are lacking behind a little bit. In other parts of the world, I think we see more and more convergence, not on every detail, but on core principles, obligations, data protection obligations, data protection rights. I think we see a lot of convergence. On our work, what we are doing to build on this and promote and facilitate data flows beyond what I said about our agenda in the trade sphere, we, as has already been pointed out, we have recently adopted a new set of standard collection clauses, which I think is a great tool to bridge differences that might still exist, because you create a contractual regime of data protection safeguards, and this will not take many years, I think, before this will take place, because the transition period that are in the SCCs, or in the decision to which the SCCs are attached, is indeed only for existing contractual relationships. For new contracts, the transition period is 3 months, and then it's over. Then you will have to use the new SCCs. I think also I don't agree that these create huge compliance burdens, as was suggested. I think it's the opposite, and that's exactly the reaction that we get from many parts of our stakeholders and from many parts of the business community. I must say I've rarely seen so positive comments and reactions from individual businesses, from trade associations, than on the SCCs, and it's because we, I think, have been able to create an instrument which indeed gives flexibility, which addresses all the major transfer scenarios, which is modular and therefore and allows docking, so therefore allows to cover also more complex and longer processing chains, and which builds, of course, on what was there, and to some extent further develops it. We had in the existing SCCs, but not with a radical change, I think, of things. So I cannot see that this would create massive compliance burdens beyond what companies had to do in the past. And I think the good news is also that it is these SCCs are aligned with the Schrems II recommendations of the EPB. And again, on this, I'm not at all disputing that there are challenges that follow from this judgment, and that will on this take a bit of time indeed for best practices to develop, for the recommendations to be put into practice, and for experience to be gained on how to make a risk assessment and what that means for particular countries. But we should also not forget that those are things which repeat themselves. There might be many data flows, but many countries and many companies will have this to certain countries, and they will be able, maybe together with others, maybe with the help of trade associations, to work through this, and they will not have to do this every time again in the future. And I also think that the issue only arises if there are problematic laws in the third country. That's sometimes now forgotten. I have the impression everybody now thinks you need to put in place additional safeguards or transfers will no longer be possible. Of course, what is new is this type of assessment, but not every third country has laws that do not live up to these very basic requirements of necessity, proportionality, access to justice, which is basically what the Schrems II judgment in the part which concerns the substantive standards is all about. Because that's, I think, is also sometimes forgotten that we're talking here of rather basic requirements, I would say. So I think the SSCs will help. They will also, I think, set a bit a standard that companies across the globe, probably also in their global operations beyond Europe, will look towards. And I think it's a good thing because as I said, it will help bridge certain differences that might exist in domestic law. And I think also there we see promising developments because we're not the only ones that have developed or are developing our model clauses. ASEAN has worked on model clauses, will continue working on them. New Zealand has developed model clauses. Latin America will do so, and the UK and others. And what I hope there is that over time we will have model clauses that work in most jurisdictions. And I think that would be a very good way to increase convergence beyond what we see already in domestic law. On specifically adequacy and more specifically even US-EU, I think adequacy decisions remain a very important tool that we want to use to facilitate data flows. And again, they require an effort. It is not an easy assessment to be carried out, but the advantage is enormous because with one go we can open data flows to every importer in a third country. It's very different from certain other tools. And we have been able to do this with important partners, and we are about to do it with two more important partners, the UK, which is now our third country, and Korea, and hopefully we will also be able to do this again with the United States. And so I think I'm more confident, I'm more optimistic about where we are going and where we are currently. And I don't think that we are in a situation where data is about to be stopped at border, where everybody localizes. There are certain parts of the world where indeed there are these trends, but again, those are exactly the kind of developments that we should fight together as those countries that are interested in open borders, in trade flows. But it should be data flows with trust. And that brings me to my last point. There is important work, I think, ongoing at the level of the OECD and maybe also in some other fora, but in particular, I would say at the OECD, to work through and work out global principles for government access. I think that is quite important that we find common ground, especially between like-minded countries. But it should be a bit more than just to distinguish ourselves from let's say, authoritarian regimes, because I think that's relatively easy to identify as sort of what are the most extreme cases of unrestricted government access. I think what we should aim for is at a high level, of course, but still to develop some common principles for government access. I think that will help us in various ways when we talk about data flows. And that's something where I hope we will also cooperate with the United States and others on this. And my very last word, because I wanted to react to that briefly. There was a mentioning at the end of Bojana's presentation on could derogations be the answer to the issues. I fail to see this. Yes, there are. I mean, derogations. I don't even know whether everybody is aware what that means, but it's basically certain statutory grounds that we have, at least in our law, for transferring data, but they're called derogations for a reason, namely because they should be only used when other transfer tools are basically not available, in particular when we're not talking about sort of ongoing structural continuous data flows. And of course, if you use these grounds, there is nothing whatsoever that you ensure in terms of the protections on the receiving end. The data exporter, of course, has to comply with data protection rules when using the derogations, but there's nothing which ensures protections on the receiving end, where the data importer is, and not just with respect to government access, but beyond that, with respect to the safeguards ensured by the company, by the receiving company itself. So that certainly cannot be the solution, certainly not the solution to the issues that have been raised maybe by the Schrems II judgment. So I am confident that the data protection authorities will stick to their line on that point, and I think they're quite right in doing so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you very much to all of you. I don't know if you want to add something or make forward reflections, because there are a lot of very, very interesting things that you said. Good news, bad news, you referred to, Bojana, the future, the different approaches, different legal systems. Alex, you underline it, this difficult between this difference between Europe and the States. Ralph, you made mention to the necessity perhaps to find common grounds and global principles. There are some questions from the public. I remember that the public might can make questions by the chat they have their screens. But anyway, we have there are some questions. You don't have to add anything. There are some questions. For instance, for all of you, on June 15, the US summit took place in Brussels, and we heard encouraging signals from the Commissioner Reinders and Secretary Raimondo reaffirming their commitment to work on an enhanced privacy shield. It's been almost 1 year since Schrems II, and there's still a lot of uncertainty as to how supervisory authorities may be enforcing the decision. What should we expect in terms of timeline and next steps after this encounter?
Is this a question to me specifically, or to Alex?
Ralph, Alex.
I don't want to I spoke for quite some time, probably too long. So I was happy if Alex comes in. I think I hope we share the view on this. It is a high priority. We are committed. I have said what I this commitment, and then there is the judgment that is our mandate on our side. I mean, that's not for the US. The US has its interests, and that's legitimate, and it has its legal framework, and it has to take care of its stakeholders and interests. On our side, we approach this with the judgment as our guiding star, and what else could we do? It's a constitutional judgment from our highest court, and which by itself is sufficient to say we have to comply with it. But beyond that, if we wouldn't, we'll just create a situation where whatever solution we find will not be stable, and it will be challenged. We all know there's no question about it. And it will go back to the Court of Justice, and it will be invalidated again, which cannot happen. It cannot happen a third time. So I cannot give a timeline. It also depends very much on how the solutions look like. There are administrative solutions, other solutions. Of course, if we don't need legislative change, that's much better, because then we talk about a completely different timeline. What is also clear, once we have at our level found some solution, it will have to would then put this into a draft decision if we think on that basis we can make another adequacy finding. But that draft decision will also, of course, have to go through our usual processes, and that involves, first of all, a further opinion from the European Data Protection Board, which also we will take very seriously, and will have to. There are several procedural steps also that one has to bear in mind. So difficult to prejudge the length of this process, but we're committed to work hard on making it as short as possible. And sorry, now I've again spoken too long. Alex, what you should.
No, I don't think there's much more to say. I mean, certainly we can't get into details about the negotiations too much. But yeah, I think there is a shared desire to move quickly on this. But we want to do this quickly, but we also want to do it well. And we are committed to fully addressing sort of the court's concerns in Schrems 2, because we do want this to be a durable agreement that provides certainty for companies. But I do think that sort of like there is some good news here, because certainly I think that we are getting a better understanding of what the requirements are. I mean, I see this almost like an iterative process where we had sort of Schrems 1, and then we made a good faith effort at trying to address those concerns and meet that legal standard. Now we have Schrems 2. We've learned a little bit more about sort of what, like, would be necessary. And then also, I mean, there is other jurisprudence that as well is being taken into account. We have sort of Privacy International case and the Project through the Net, again, and other cases. So, I mean, we're getting there. I mean, it definitely takes a good deal of work, but we are committed to working through this in partnership with the Commission. And we are trying to do this as quickly as possible, because we recognize the uncertainty and negative impacts on industry. But yeah, I can't really sort of say much more, make a prediction about timing.
Okay, thank you. Two questions. One for Ralph. Does the European Commission consider valid the white paper issued by the United States Department of Commerce, where it's indicated that the disclosure of information to the authorities may be based on the GDPR's derogation of public interest?
Sorry, I was muted. So first of all, I don't think I was how does one say that? It befits me to comment on a paper that has been issued by the U.S. government. To the extent it let's say describes the US situation and in terms of what is out there, in terms of safeguards, in terms of limitations, I maybe have some would have some questions on some points, but I think overall that's how we understand the situation indeed, but that's also the situation I think as it was before the Court of Justice, because there was a lot of material before the Court of Justice. Mind you that this was a case which is a preliminary reference case, so it came out of a national procedure before the Irish High Court, which for months took depositions on US law essentially. So there was a huge factual basis, and then of course our decision I think was also it was the most detailed decision we have ever adopted in this space, and it contained a very detailed description of US law and practice. So I don't think there is so much difference between that and what you see in the white paper, but the important thing is that that's what the Court of Justice looked at, and then nevertheless identified certain issues, and those are the ones that we now try to work through. When it comes to derogations, I would maybe turn it around. It's perhaps also not for the US government to proclaim itself on whether under EU law a certain transfer tool can be used. I think that is ultimately for the enforcers to decide, and those are the data protection authorities, and they have of course put out guidance exactly on the derogations, and ultimately if it becomes contentious, it's for the courts, national courts, and then eventually the Court of Justice. So and I think you mentioned specifically the public interest derogation. I'm not quite sure how that would come in. I mean, what we're talking about is commercial data transfers, which are then where the data then subsequently in the third country might be accessed by public authorities for law enforcement or national security reasons. So the original transfer is a commercial transfer. I mean, that's what the court looked at in Schrems 2. So I don't quite see sort of how the public interest derogation could play a role in assessing this question.
Alex? And Bojana, if you want to add something about the white paper, Bojana?
No, I mean, I just sort of agree. I mean, the white paper, I mean, is a representation about sort of like U.S. law and practice, and is meant to provide sort of additional information and clarity on some of those things. I mean, certainly there have been sort of developments in sort of U.S. Law and practice since that we did want to make it clear and sort of bring up in that white paper. And then also for the issue of derogations, I'd have to go back and take a look at the specific text, but also I think we did include language in there that essentially said that sort of certainly you need to check with your supervisory authorities about again using sort of other transfer mechanisms in this interim period while we're trying to negotiate an enhanced privacy shield framework.
Okay, thank you. Another question for all of you. So how can be legitimated nowadays the data transfers from the EU to the US after substitute? Bojana.
Okay, well, well, I always believe in risk-based approach, because that's what's actually ultimately in GDPR as well. If you look at Article 24, the whole GDPR has to be implemented and interpreted based on risks to individuals and any harm. So as of today, companies are already trying to put in place supplementary measures, and they're trying to put in place supplementary measures. Could be a number, right? They could be organizational, they could be technical, they could be contractual. Of course, now that we've got the SECs, that gives some legal certainty, and companies will be using that, but they will have to conduct the risk assessment, right? They have to look at the particular data transfer to a particular country, and then make first a judgment call on the rule of law and practical implementation
in respect of government access to data. And I disagree with Ralph. I think there are lots of countries which will not pass the test of the Court of Justice. In fact, majority of the world would not pass that. Certainly the big countries, not just US. So that's but that's risk-based, right? And I think the board kind of allowed this. Says, you have to look at everything, the whole context of your transfer, and you will make a decision. And then you have to still take supplementary measures to kind of minimize the risk as much as possible. I call this peeling of the onion, right? You have to look at all kinds of data flows. You've got your HR data flows, your IT, you've got your third-party data flows for various contractual necessities. So you have to sort of for each of these, for different types of data, you have to conduct these risk assessments and decide what works. And then ultimately, I think people will still use SCCs because they're the easiest thing to use. And to point that Ralph disagreed with me, Ralph, they are huge compliance burden because nobody to date did anything about SCCs other than sign them and put in a drawer or in an electronic filing cabinet. There are rare companies, and I worked for one, where actually we put in place a privacy compliance program based on the SCCs because we said, how do we comply with what we have written in these contracts? Majority of companies do nothing, and they can't because it's far too complex. So they have got a whole global program or something else. But now they will absolutely have to make sure that everything they sign in that contract, they're able to comply with. Because guess what? If they can't show, including putting pressure on the importer, requesting audits, requesting, transparency, and all the things that importer has to comply with. I now, as an exporter, have to make sure they do that. So there is much more compliance burden. There's no doubt about that. But that's our system, right? So we have to do that. And because this hasn't been done before, it's like a huge jump. So I think that's what companies will do. I think companies will still try to use BCRs, and I think BCRs are a good method. Of course, it will have to be looked at through the prism of the board's recommendation and what SECs have got. So the question will also rise, how do I make sure that when data goes to other countries under BCR, that my other entities do not disclose data to governments as a result of surveillance intelligence laws. But it will be easier because it's within the group of the companies. It's much easier to control, you see. It's easier to control your own group of companies. You've got systems in place, you've got procedures, you know what your US or Indian or Russian or Chinese entities do, right? And they're going to tell you as a matter of your privacy compliance if there is something like that. It's more difficult to control third parties, which is why control to process or control to controller, that's harder when it's not intra-group transfer. So that's I think what companies will do. I think some companies will use derogations. Those who are going to be in the checkmate position, and I keep meeting them all the time who are telling me we don't know what to do because we might be subject to the US surveillance. And does this mean we stop? And I can't believe they will stop. So they will have to think about something, and we'll probably have a court case that will test some of this stuff, unless we have shield beforehand. And then, of course, the Pandora box is going to be open for some other country. So I think that's the current. That's what companies will do. And we will see some challenges by DPAs. I have no doubt, because DPAs they'll be pressurized to check how things are working from in 3 months' time, from the moment that the SECs come into play. So it's just uncertain times. I mean, Ralph, you can talk. It's tough out there. It's for data privacy officers, for lawyers. It's a very tough time, and leaders of the companies are saying, "What the hell is happening? What do we do? Do we shut down operations here? Do we move data somewhere else? Do we open data center?" These are massive, big corporate decisions. So just saying like everything will be okay, I think that's a little bit of an understatement, and it's not a reflection of how complicated, how hard job of data privacy officers and lawyers are at the moment in companies because of data flows. So that's all. I think it's not easy, but we'll get there.
It's not easy.
No.
Ralph?
Yeah, and again, I think. If you listened, I had said that I'm not saying that there are not challenges. I'm not saying everything is okay. I said that there will be a period where companies indeed will have to adjust, and where best practice and experience has to develop. I said all of this, but I think that indeed the SECs will remain in the absence of an adequacy finding, obviously, will remain the most important tool, because also other tools under Article 46 of the GDPR, other tools that ensure appropriate safeguards, have, of course, to comply in the same way with the Schrems II judgment. So that doesn't change anything. So why then not use the SECs, which are brand new and are there? But there on this point, because I mean that I find fascinating. So I understand now that the huge compliance burden comes from the fact that there was complete non-compliance in the past. That is, of course, one way of expressing things. But then I have very little sympathy for anyone who now claims that there is a huge compliance burden created through the GDPR or the new SECs. If what we are talking about is basically that in the past this was a paper exercise and nobody cared. I'm surprised that, because companies engage in all kinds of commitments and contractual obligations, and I tend to think they usually take them seriously. So I'm a bit surprised that one element of these contractual obligations, which are the model data protection clauses, would have been completely left aside, and I also don't see why it wouldn't be possible, because again, we're talking about basic principles which are, again, more and more worldwide recognized of sticking to a certain purpose, keeping data not forever, securing the data, allowing certain rights, which, I mean, what are we talking about? Right to access, mainly, right to correction. You cannot tell me that this is the end of the world. So I don't buy. I don't see that this is an insurmountable task, and it should certainly not be an insurmountable task if in the past companies, and I'm sure there's many sort of honest companies that already in the past tried to comply with data protection rules, and they will be quite able to do so in the future. Aside from this is the Schrems II question. That is new. There's no question about it, and that I'm not disputing. This raises challenges. So I think, to your answer, I think it will be the SECs, and then of course in certain situations you can rely on derogations. It's just not the panacea for all kinds of transfers, because there are very strict conditions, and that includes, for instance, also where a data transfer is necessary to comply with the contract with the individual, because it must be necessary for that, and even that is subject to an interpretation which for good reasons is strict.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are on time, but just there is just a question, very practical. 5 seconds, please. Very practical and very specific, but very important for a lot of companies. The remote access to data in terms of technical assistance by the service providers can be considered as an international transfer?
The answer is yes, but it's probably the risk is going to be smaller than where you are actually transferring data and the data goes to a third party of their system. So yes, it is technically it's a transfer.
Certainly, if that possibility is made use of, no? I mean, of course, if data never travels, I'm not sure I would call it a transfer, but if that possibility is made use of, so if the question is just whether data is actively sent or retrieved by a company abroad, with that I agree. That doesn't make the difference. If you have access to a database in Europe as a foreign company, and you make use of that, that constitutes a transfer, and I think there is even direct support for this in Article 49 when it comes to certain registers. Another question is perhaps if the mere possibility, whether that is a transfer, because if data doesn't move, I find it a bit more questionable. But So the general answer, I think, is yes.
Well, thank you. It's not clear. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bojana, Alex, Ralph, for your amazing thoughts and speech. Well, there are a lot of questions on international data flows. Well, we are finishing our international conference. We've been talking about the future of data governance. We made reference to the IPA regulation, to the proposal of the Data Governance Act, the necessity of clarify the legal framework about the use of data. There's really a situation of over-regulation. We've been talking also about international data transfers with a lot of difficulties with different approaches, but the question is that the most important technological companies that provide, for instance, cloud services are in US, and the data to be protected according to our laws are in Europe. So we have, it is necessary for companies, for market, for individuals, we have to clarify the situation, have to arrive a solution in terms of the clear legal framework regarding international data flows. Well, thank you very much for all of you, for the speakers, for the members of the board of the chair. Thank you very much to the representatives of the universities, of these 4 universities, Roma III, Nova, Athens, San Paulo CEU, de Madrid. Thanks to Google, thanks to European Data Protection Supervisor, and of course, thank you very much to the public, to the attendees that are attending this first international conference of this new chair, South European Union Google Data Governance Chair. We hope we can find in person in the near future. Thank you very much to everybody, and well, I think that we can finish our first international conference here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and see you. Bye bye. Bye bye.